Good morning, everybody. My name is Ben Tomczyk on behalf of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, What's Going On with the Social Security and Medicare Trust Funds. We have two great panels lined up for you this morning, and we are so excited that you could join us. Before we begin, there's just a couple housekeeping items I want to make folks aware of. The first is we are recording this event, and we will be sending a video of the event out after, probably later this week. Additionally, we hope to make today's event as conversational as possible. So please, at any time during the discussion, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. In addition to that, if you'd like to direct your question to a specific panelist, we ask that you note that as well when submitting the question. And now to help open today's event, I'd like to introduce my colleague at the committee, Mark Goldwine, Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here today. Very excited for yet another virtual event, I think, on a really important topic. We learned yesterday from the Social Security and Medicare trustees that both those programs are in serious financial jeopardy, heading towards pretty rapid insolvency. According to the trustees, the Medicare Trust Fund, the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, is only 5 years from running out of reserves. And the Social Security Trust Funds, on a combined basis, only about 13 years. If you think about it, that means a new retiree, a 62-year-old today, will reach the normal retirement age at the time that Medicare runs out of reserves and payments to their providers and therefore access gets cut. They will be 75 years old at the time that Social Security runs out of reserves. And without changes to the law, their benefits would be cut across the board by 22%. There's not a lot of time to act. This isn't about saving Social Security and Medicare for your kids and for your grandkids and your great-grandkids. We actually got to save it for your grandparents at this point. I'm really excited today that we have an event to discuss both of these trust funds and their implications. We're going to, in a minute, go over to a panel led by Kate Davidson of the Wall Street Journal, who's going to moderate it, and I, along with a couple others, participate. But first, I want to introduce a quick video from Chairman Larson, head of the Social Security Subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. I do want to caveat that this video was recorded prior to the trustees report, which wasn't released in very much warning. So if there's a date that's off by a bit, cut him a little bit of a break. But let's go to that video now, Ben.
Thank you to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget for inviting me to speak to you via video on this important subject. Social Security is our nation's most important income security and anti-poverty program. Over its 85 years, it has never missed a payment and has been the foundation for Americans' retirement. You know, 65 million Americans currently receive benefits, and nearly 180 million workers are paying into Social Security with each and every paycheck, expecting, of course, that Social Security will be there when they need it. The latest trustees report confirms that Social Security's near-term finances remain strong, but that the program faces a shortfall that must soon be addressed. What the report underscores is the need for Congress to act soon to prevent across-the-board benefit cuts next decade, while strengthening Social Security for today's seniors and for future generations. I can tell you, as chair of the Ways and Means Social Security Subcommittee, I am working with my colleagues in Congress and President Biden to strengthen Social Security. It's that important. The COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis have highlighted just how vital Social Security is to our nation's retirees, workers with disabilities, survivors, and children. We simply cannot afford to let politics get in the way of saving this program and securing its trust fund. As President Biden has rightly pointed out, Social Security is a sacred trust between the American people and their government. With 10,000 baby boomers becoming eligible for Social Security every day, The time to act is now, and millennials will need this program more than baby boomers. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. My name is Kate Davidson with the Wall Street Journal, and thanks to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget for hosting this discussion today. We are going to hear from Kathleen Romig of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, from Mark Goldwine, who you just heard from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and from Reed Ribble, former Republican congressman from Wisconsin. So thank you to all of you for joining this panel. Each of them are going to start with some introductory remarks and help give us sort of an overview of what we learned in yesterday's trustees report about Social Security in particular and where we go from here. Just a quick reminder that you can enter your questions at any time in the Q&A function on Zoom in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. So Kathleen, if you're ready, do you want to kick us off and just tell us a little bit about what was in the report yesterday?
Sure. Well, this year's trustees report is being released at a really dark time. 18 months into a global pandemic, when over 1,000 Americans are still dying of COVID every single day. Social Security was born of crisis in the Great Depression, and it rises to the occasion during crises. Over 600,000 Americans have died of COVID, and many of their family members are already receiving Social Security survivors benefits. Some COVID long haulers face long-term disabling symptoms, and they may be eligible for Social Security disability benefits. Some workers were forced to accelerate their retirement plans because of the pandemic, and Social Security has been there for them too. And existing beneficiaries continued to receive their Social Security checks even when the economy plummeted. This year's trustees report shows us that financially, Social Security has weathered COVID better than many people, including me, feared at the beginning of the pandemic. Social Security is mostly funded through payroll tax revenues, the taxes that almost every worker contributes from each paycheck. When payrolls plummeted by tens of millions of jobs last spring, there was a real concern that Social Security's finances would significantly deteriorate. But the economy bounced back more quickly than anticipated, and the so-called K-shaped recovery meant that most higher earners continued to contribute to Social Security uninterrupted. So the program's finances are only slightly worse than predicted before the pandemic. The trustees now expect Social Security to keep paying full benefits until 2034, when its trust fund reserves will be depleted. So what happens then? Well, workers will keep paying their Social Security taxes out of every paycheck, and higher income beneficiaries will continue to pay the taxes on part of their benefits. Together, those revenues can finance over 3/4 of promised benefits forever. So please put out of your mind any talk of bankruptcy or other melodrama in today's headlines. I'd like to push back a little bit on the language my hosts here at CRFB are using about the trustees report. Their statement yesterday said, time is running out to save Social Security. This is just not correct. Today's workers pay for today's beneficiaries, with the trust funds supplementing what workers pay in. The same goes for tomorrow's workers, who will pay for tomorrow's beneficiaries. And that remains true even after Social Security's trust funds reserves are depleted. In fact, before 1983 amendments, Social Security had very few trust fund reserves. Social Security is not in mortal peril, and it does not need to be saved. It's permanent law, and it's deeply woven into American life. Alarmists who imply that Social Security won't be around when today's young workers retire either misunderstand or misrepresent the trustees' projections. Now, mind you, only being able to finance 3/4 of promised benefits is a problem, but it's a manageable one. Because Social Security benefits are modest and the main source of income for most beneficiaries, policymakers should improve the program's financial outlook primarily on the revenue side. The majority of Americans of all political stripes oppose cuts to Social Security and support strengthening the program by contributing more. Revenues could come from raising the payroll tax cap, which has eroded due to income inequality. To his great credit, Congressman Ribble's bipartisan plan would raise that cap. Other revenue options include subjecting more types of compensation to the payroll tax or raising the payroll tax rate in small steps. This conversation today is so important. We do need to strengthen Social Security's finances, so it continues to be there for American workers in good times and bad. Thank you.
And I think Mark is going to walk us through some more of kind of give us more context on what this all means, what we learned yesterday. So whenever you're ready, Mark.
Sure, and I'm glad to be here. And Kathleen, I appreciate your gentle pushback. I'll revise our statement. You can leave so many words in a line to say, time is running out to sensibly save Social Security, to make sensible solutions. We could, of course, wait until 2034. And in 2034, the law says benefits be cut 22%. We come up with other solutions, immediately raise taxes very rapidly, immediately cut benefits, borrow from general revenue or from Medicare or something else. But all of those solutions are in every way inferior to acting now and making the kinds of gradual changes that can be targeted to those most able to afford, that can give people time to plan and adjust, that can generally exempt, for example, current beneficiaries, phase things in gradually. And saving Social Security from a 22% across the board benefit cut, which is massive, isn't just an imperative. It's not just important to help the program. It's actually an opportunity. Social Security reform offers an opportunity, I think, to make some really important improvements. For one, as important as Social Security is, there are vulnerable groups that don't get adequate protection from benefits. People with intermittent work histories and low lifetime history. In some cases, widows, depending on your sort of relative, and widowers, depending on your relative earnings with your spouse. And strengthening Social Security in any kind of way takes 60 votes, by the way. You can't do it through reconciliation. The best way we're probably going to get those enhancements is through some kind of solvency package. Second, Social Security reform offers an opportunity to promote faster economic growth, faster income growth. Social Security, if you think about it, is more intertwined into the economy than almost any other government program. It's the largest tax most people pay. It's the largest source of retirement income for most folks. And it's probably the largest signal out there for when to retire, how much to save, and how much to work. Smart changes to Social Security, to formulas, to retirement ages, to the tax base, to the overall solvency can actually enhance economic growth. We've estimated, for example, a plan that we put forward by developing my colleagues could boost economic growth by about 0.25% per year. If you also count changes to Medicare and the Highway Trust Fund, about 30 basis points per year. After 3 decades, that's a $9,000 per person increase in income. Penn Wharton Budget Model and CBO have come up with other relatively similar numbers. Third, it's an opportunity to make a better and fairer payroll tax. As Kathleen hinted at, right now, the payroll tax only applies to about the first $140,000 of income, and it doesn't apply to a lot of forms of compensation. This is inefficient in that it causes us, it causes businesses and employers to make compensation decisions based on the tax code, and it's inequitable in that higher earners pay less as a share of their income than lower earners. That could be fixed. Fourth, Social Security reform can help contribute to our long-term fiscal situation. If you look at sort of our long-term debt projections, we have debt headed, according to CBO, up to about 200% of GDP under current law within 3 decades. A lot of that is driven by the assumption that the trust funds will borrow after insolvency. If we were to make Social Security, Medicare, and the Highway Trust Fund solvent, that number would only be about 120, 130% of GDP. Still much higher than a fiscal hawk like me is comfortable with, but a lot better than 200% of GDP. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, a bipartisan plan to save Social Security, I think, would prove to the American public that Washington can work, that our policymakers can come together and solve big problems. That's what we did in 1983. No one lost their election because of it. I think people had a renewed confidence in government, one that sadly isn't there at this time. So I would look at Social Security as a challenge and a need, but also an important opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And Congressman Ripple, you're going to walk us through the political implications, which are a whole other story that Mark sort of hinted at. How do you see the situation now? You're not in Washington anymore, so you have maybe a more, perhaps more objective eye. And what is yesterday's report? How does that sort of change your outlook at all?
Yeah, I don't think yesterday's report changes it at all. Members of Congress have known this for a very long time. I mean, I went into Congress in 2011, and we knew that the trust fund was degrading, and that at some point there will be a reduction in benefits, as Kathleen pointed out. So we know that that's going to happen. What's changed from then till now are 2 key things. the window of time in which to fix the problem has gotten shorter, which means it's going to be more expensive to fix. And the second thing is the partisan divide has gotten greater, making it more difficult to deal with this topic. And I would say that there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is that whatever party's got full control of the Congress should shove a reform through via reconciliation. The problem with that method of fixing things is that you never have full buy-in by the American public. And in essence, you have to have a bipartisan fix that has enough bad things in it that both sides feel the pain and they give something up. And the other thing is that a lot of the fixes, not just are partisan, but a lot of the fixes don't go all the way. They're partial fixes to it. And that doesn't really solve the problem. And the reason none of those partial fixes actually ever get embedded into law is because there's not enough trading chits inside the legislation with which to compromise with the other side. And when I was in Congress, I wrote, since I was the only member of Congress to write an actual bipartisan sponsored bill in the last 25 or 30 years, I know how difficult it is because Republicans want to see everything centered around benefit reductions and no additional revenue. Democrats want no benefit reductions and want 100% revenue. And the fact of the matter is neither of those things are politically feasible. You can't get that through Congress. And so you have, when I say you have to write a piece of legislation that has enough things that both sides hate, Republicans need to recognize that you're not going to fix this problem with just benefit reductions or changes. And Democrats need to recognize you're not going to fix this just with revenue. And until we get enough members of Congress to accept that reality, and that is, by the way, reality, there is no such thing as a fix to the Social Security Trust Fund absent political acceptance of it. And if it's not politically real, it's not real. And we have to be very, very careful, in my opinion, on either of those extremes. If we take just the approach that we're going to deal with it on the revenue side, that will result in a very significant tax increase on everybody. At the very moment that we've just spent nearly or stimulated our economy with nearly 50% of the nation's GDP. So we're already in a precarious spot financially nationally. So we have to recognize that there's going to be tax increases coming just as a result of what's happened due to COVID. So adding more here is going to be a problem. But most importantly is if you raise the rate of the payroll tax, you in essence create a disincentive for businesses to increase employment. So when the government wanted people to stop smoking, what did they do? They applied a tax to it and they called it a sin tax. We want to be careful that we don't increase the cost of employment too high to where employment goes down in this country. So the idea of adding revenue by increasing the cap seems to make sense to me. And in fact, today's current generation is actually paying less in taxes than what our parents did. And as Kathleen pointed out, it's the current generation, working generation, that's paying for current recipients of the benefit. So we need to address it by beginning to move that cap up to at least its historical norm of around 90% of payrolls. That would take the cap from where it is today all the way up to about 350,000. And you've got time to phase it in, and then you could benchmark it there. But we also need to recognize that people are living longer. And so we should adjust the benefits based on longevity and index that. And so there are things that could be done by taking a look at the COLA, by taking a look at the benefit structure, taking a look at longevity, and taking a look at revenue in a comprehensive package that would do all these things. And that, in my opinion, it's the only way to get something that's politically feasible to do. And this would cause both sides to come together and hopefully begin to resolve this. But the longer they wait, the harder it's going to be. I worked on it for 5 years, and every year I had to change what I was doing simply because I was like a dog chasing my tail. I couldn't catch the degradation of it. And so anything that I talked about in my bill in 2016 is now not enough to fix it if you want to have a full fix in place by 2034. And so here's the key thing that the American people need to do. Members of Congress are fearful if they fix this problem. And what needs to happen is we need to make members of Congress fearful if they don't. And that's the real fix here, is the American people must demand a fix. And it has to come from both sides. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kate, and to continue our discussion.
Thank you. Thanks. You've all given us a lot to chew over. I'd love to start with digging in a little bit deeper into what Kathleen mentioned, which is sort of what you all expected at the beginning of the pandemic last year. We know that this pandemic recession was different from previous recessions in so many ways that we're still kind of learning, but we learned a lot about last year. What did that mean for Social Security? And you mentioned a little bit of it, Kathleen, sort of the faster recovery, but whoever wants to start, kind of dig in a little bit more.
Happy to jump in. I talked a little bit about the revenue side, and on the benefit side, honestly, it didn't go as I expected either. I thought that the pandemic would really accelerate retirement for a lot of people. I thought there would be a lot more early retirement claims. And in fact, because of other measures, emergency measures that Congress took, for example, the expanded unemployment insurance that did protect people who lost their jobs, including older workers, and because of the economic impact payments, not as many people needed to claim benefits earlier than they had hoped. And that's really good news for retirees because, as some people may know, if you claim benefits early, then you get a lower monthly benefit for life. And so the fact that people were buoyed by these economic impact payments and they were protected by these unemployment insurance benefits, they were able to delay that Social Security claim and thus have a higher monthly benefit for life than they otherwise would have. So that's really good news. And that's not something that I had expected at the outset. I also expected disability claims to increase. I thought that because of the long haul COVID symptoms, we'd see more disability claims. And in fact, we saw fewer disability claims than last year, fewer disability claims than expected. And, we don't know precisely why that is, but the working theory is it's because Social Security's field operation is shut down and people need assistance in finding out about those benefits and applying for those benefits. And so we don't know. I mean, the trustees are projecting that we will see an uptick in disability claims and allowances, over the next year or two, in part due to long haul COVID and in part due to just pent up demand for disability benefits because fewer people applied. So we saw fewer than expected. We also saw way more deaths than any of us would have hoped. It's just horrible. And those deaths were really disproportionately among Social Security beneficiaries. There were 400,000 more deaths than anticipated in 2020 alone among Social Security beneficiaries. That includes COVID deaths, and that also includes other deaths, probably indirectly related to the pandemic because of access to medical care and other issues. 400,000 more deaths than anticipated. So obviously, those people are no longer receiving benefits in their own right, but they're survivors. Many of them are receiving benefits, and so these various factors surprised me, and they offset each other in various ways, and that's why we're sort of not exactly as bad as we expected. I guess the one thing I did anticipate correctly as a working mother is I thought that birth rates would decline. Some people thought there would be a baby boom because everyone was at home, and I pretty quickly figured out that probably wasn't in the cards, and in fact it wasn't. And the trustees are showing, that they think birth rates are going to go down at least temporarily for the next couple of years as parents kind of bounce back from this.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things real quick. The one is that Social Security's finances have deteriorated some relative to last year's trustees report. Before they were projecting 2035 insolvency date, depletion date, now it's 2034. Before they were projecting 3.2% of payroll shortfall, now it's 3.5. Most of that long-term worsening is actually unrelated to the pandemic. It's methodological changes. But that short-term is because we lost a year of a lot of payroll tax revenue. I think what a lot of us thought is that we would lose many years of a lot of payroll tax revenue, is that the unemployment rate would take a very long time to creep up, that the high level of unemployment would lead wages to remain depressed, that we would be in sort of this period of sort of long recovery for a while. And that's not been the case. And I think part of that was because myself included, some of us underestimated the dynamism and adaptability of the US economy, and maybe our tolerance to COVID on the, and I think a lot of that is because of the very strong fiscal and monetary response, which had the direct effects, I think, of injecting money into the economy, getting people back to work faster, pushing up wages. Also had some indirect effects. I think another piece of disability that Kathleen talked about, the long haul COVID, but typically in recessions, we see a big increase in disability because disability is not binary, right? So there are a lot of people that are disabled that in the right economic circumstances may be able to work, and in the wrong economic circumstances, there may not be jobs available for them. They have a disability, they would qualify, but when a strong economy, they can have a job. With a weak economy, they may not be able to. Historically, we've seen disability rates therefore go up in recessions. We didn't see that this time. Maybe it's because of the field offices, but I suspect a lot of it is because unemployment benefits were actually much more generous than disability. And for many folks, provided that gap that now some of them are hopefully going back to work, and some of them may ultimately now be going out to disability roles. So overall, I would say the situation's worse, but not nearly as much worse as we expected. One thing I'll add is that the trustees' economic estimates don't appear to account for the very high rate of inflation that we're seeing this year. They expect 3% CPI. I think we're more likely to be about 5%. They also don't seem to account for the very fast rate of GDP growth this year. And so I think their near-term economic assumptions are probably a little off on both, and I don't know how that's going to play out.
And Kate, I would add one other thing. We do need to give the private sector some credit here. There's millions and millions of workers that are now working from home. So if you have a modest disability and you're able to work from home, it's much easier for you to work from home than it is to have to get in public transportation or find a way into work. And that's the same for older workers. As Kathleen mentioned, she thought you'd see a wave of retirements, which didn't happen. It's in part because if you're 62 and we're thinking of retiring, but your employer is now letting you work from home, all of a sudden that becomes pretty appealing to you. And so the private sector has been really good about allowing people to adapt to a new paradigm of work here in the US. And I think that's been one of the big benefits that we've seen. And that's why the trust fund didn't degrade as much as we might have anticipated a year ago.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting point, and leads me to my next question, which is kind of, over the long term, what are the sort of unknowns about how COVID really changed things? And some of the things you mentioned sort of apply, but like we mentioned long haul COVID, and how that might affect disability, and there was a little bit of a discussion. Some administration officials held a call with reporters, but I know you all don't get to listen to that. So I'd love to hear. We tried to include some of it in my story, but I know it's something you all are thinking about too, and sort of the different factors that are kind of some of them working at odds, if you will. But what are some of the things we don't know about how COVID is going to affect things over the long term?
I think the biggest concern we have is that we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And we really don't know. And the only real example we have of a global pandemic goes back to 1917, where science wasn't the same as it is today. And my expectation is that science is going to overcome this, and it's going to happen faster than we thought it was going to happen. And the long throw impacts are going to be how we work, not whether we work.
Okay, that's a great point. I know, Kathleen, you've thought a lot about the disability piece. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you often hear, it's a novel coronavirus. It's novel. We really don't know. And the criteria for Social Security disability benefits, it really has to be a long-term disability, a disability that's expected to last 12 months or result in death. We've been in this pandemic now for 18 months. Even people who got it at the very beginning, many of them haven't even had the opportunity to have serious symptoms for at least 12 months. And so we just don't know. And it also, this disease manifests in such strange ways, especially over the long term, and such a variety of ways, that we really are just going to need to see a lot more research to really understand how it affects people over the long term. And not only the virus itself, but also, we do have more evidence on how some of these treatments affect people over the long term. Once you've been on a ventilator, you are often, that can have lifelong consequences for how your body functions. And so we really need to get a better grasp on what this looks like. And SSA is going to have to get really specific in its guidance about what type of long haul symptoms and what extent of long haul symptoms do qualify for disability benefits, because they not only does it have to be 12 months, or result in death, it also has to preclude work at what's called the substantial gainful activity level, or just substantial work. And so, we have to also consider like how these symptoms interact with work. And then as Congressman Ribble, so aptly pointed out, the workplace is changing. What does that mean? And that's another big unknown. What is remote work going to look like? How does this affect retirement over the long term? If remote work is more accessible, how does it, we see this shaking out at different parts of the income spectrum in different ways. I mean, that there are so many economic factors that are just unknown. And I just think there's just more uncertainty in all of these factors, birth rates too, more parents are feeling pretty unsupported and thinking about those choices differently. So I think there's just more uncertainty in every single one of these factors than I've ever seen in my whole career looking at this.
Mm-hmm. This seems like, I have some more questions, but this seems like a good point to maybe work in one question from the Q&A from a participant. This is from Elizabeth Bauer. The 2021 report reduced the long-term unemployment rate assumption from 5% to 4.5% and boosted the fertility assumption from 1.95 to 2.0, as well as assuming that the pandemic triggered baby bust will result entirely with women having babies later rather than not at all. What are the justifications offered by the trustees for these assumptions, and do you all agree with them?
I'll take the unemployment. I'll let Kathleen take the fertility rate one. I have one kid is plenty of a handful during a pandemic. I will tell you that as personal testimony. It's been clear for some time that the economy can, on a regular basis, sustain an unemployment rate well below 5%. We have this theory called the natural rate of unemployment, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, where we basically think we can get to an unemployment rate that doesn't cause inflation. And we used to think that was 5 or 6%. But as recently as 2019, we were at about 3.5% without substantial inflation. I'm not sure if we could have remained at 3.5%. That's not clear, but it's very clear we could be below 5%. And the Federal Reserve has made very clear that its target is going to be something closer to 4%. So I still think 75 years is a long time. And I think the trustees assuming that things will change again makes sense. But if I was doing a 10-year estimate of what I thought would be the full employment rate, I would be looking even lower than what the trustees are, at something closer to 4%.
Yeah, on fertility, I think Mark's point is well taken. Not everything is about COVID. A lot of the changes that we're seeing are methodological changes that were already in the works, before the pandemic hit. And in fact, the trustees' fertility assumptions are one of those things. They had a big technical panel in recent year, a couple of years ago, where they worked closely with academic experts and tried to get a better handle on fertility trends. And they actually changed the way that they estimate fertility in this year's report, doing it based on a cohort model. And so I think, some of this stuff really has nothing to do with COVID. I would say that trustees are typically pretty conservative in how they change their assumptions. So when they see, like, for example, when disability applications started to go down several years ago, about a decade ago, they just adjusted it for a year or two at a time, and they didn't assume that it was a long-term trend. It takes some time before they start to assume that something is a long-term trend. At first, they just say, okay, we can see this trend, in this recent year's data, and we're going to account for that, but we're not going to alter the long-term projection. And I think that's what they're doing with fertility, and I think that's the right thing to do with fertility. Nobody really knows. There's lots of uncertainty, and so so it makes sense that they would expect birth rates to go down over the next year or two. They already have gone down pretty significantly during this past year, and that makes perfect sense. And it also makes sense that they would reserve judgment about the long-term trends, because we just don't know yet.
And I would agree with both of the comments by Mark and Kathleen. We don't really know where fertility is going to go, but if we look at it over the last 20 years, we look at it globally, we do know that most first world countries are having declining birth rates, and that's just a reality. And so you can anticipate, to go to Mark's question, where does this workforce come from then? There was likely to be a global competition for labor at some point, and you're going to have to address it with immigration. We've just gone through 4 years of very restrictive immigration policy here in the US. And so the workforce could actually shrink both by immigration policy and by birth rates or fertility. And so these types of changes will have a dramatic impact on what the long-term fund looks like over time.
Just to add to that, this is one of those cases, I agree, thanks to the declining fertility, restrictions on immigration, et cetera. This is one of those cases where there is a risk of a declining workforce, but the problem can be part of the solution, which is that the types of changes that we make to Social Security and make outside of Social Security can help make it easier to expand the workforce, make it easier for second earners to be in the workforce, and can make it easier for people to work longer. And I'm a big fan of more flexible retirement. Right now, most people think of retirement as binary. Either you work or you don't work. You do everything every day of your life, and then one day you just don't go to the office. There's actually many models of retirement. There's phased retirement. There's encore careers. There's delayed retirement. There's spending time with your family. There's consulting. There's all sorts of different things you can do. And I think that having more flexibility and some of what we've learned from COVID, about, I think, how precious time is with the family, but also about how work from home can really function well, may make a lot of that easier.
Okay, thanks. I want to make sure we get to inflation, which you mentioned, Mark. Last year's report came out in April when we knew there was this huge pandemic, but of course it had been prepared earlier. So the trustees acknowledged at the time, look, this really doesn't take into account the effects of the pandemic. It feels a little bit like this year, that's kind of the case with inflation. They recognize that it was expected to be higher, but it's looking like it's going to be much higher by the end of the year than maybe the report, fully takes into account. So what is the trajectory in your view, Mark? Is a little bit separate from just Social Security. I know you've been talking a lot about this and what it means for economic policy, but what do those high inflation levels this year mean for Social Security, for beneficiaries, and just for the costs to, an effect on the program?
So let me start by saying that I think that the trustees' long-term inflation estimates are very reasonable. They assume 2.4% CPI growth. Maybe it's going to be 2.2, maybe it's going to be 2.5, but I think it's very reasonable. But they are dramatically underestimating this year's inflation. They think it's going to be about 3%. The mid-session review, OMB thinks it's going to be 4.8%. If there was no inflation for the rest of the year, in other words, if inflation stopped now, it would be 4.4%. So there's almost no way we're going 3% unless we have mass deflation for the rest of the year. That's good news for beneficiaries in the sense they're getting a higher COLA, but they're only getting a higher COLA to pay for their higher cost of living, right? So overall, not necessarily good news, and not necessarily good news for the program. But there's a corollary to that. CPI is going to be higher. So do we expect is wage inflation. And so money that comes into the trust fund also is probably going to be higher. In terms of net effect on the program's finances, my guess is it's going to be a cost, but not a big one. In terms of what it means for seniors' expectations, I do worry when you have 1 year of very high COLA followed by another year that might be a much more modest COLA. And people aren't very good at understanding which of the costs they face go up and which they don't. And they get sometimes very angry at what is actually very reasonable inflation adjustment. So I do worry about zigzagging inflation for peace of mind for beneficiaries.
Okay, thanks so much. Can we talk about, let's move on to talking about legislation, which of course Congressman Ribble talked about a little bit about his ideas and has put forward some proposals during his time in Congress. What is the legislation that's currently being considered? And also what has the Biden administration put forward to address this issue? And is it a partial fix? How adequate is it in your view? Who wants to start with this one?
I mean, it's adequate. I mean, if you eliminate the cap entirely, that is really pushing a lot of revenue into this system. And President Biden's fix is he said he doesn't want to raise taxes on anybody earning less than $400,000. So he creates, in essence, a donut hole. And so you don't have an increase if you're at the current cap and up to $400,000. When your income gets above that, then the cap gets reinstated. I think all of these ideas ought to be on the table, and then you discuss them and you try to work with them. But I would say it's not politically feasible, and something that's not politically feasible isn't real. And that's I know it's harsh to say that, but if that's just the reality, you have to pass this through Congress. And if they don't pass it between now and 2022, history would say that Republicans are at a bare minimum going to take back the House. And I think that that's probably a pretty realistic assumption you can make. And then you're back to ground zero again. And so it would be much better to start from a baseline of we're going to look at everything. We're going to look at should we raise the age for full retirement age or maximum retirement age? Do we need to expand benefits for the very aged? Because those are often widows that are now living in poverty. How do we cut senior poverty? And you can do that by increasing a benefit for certain subsets inside Social Security. And then how do you move the entire paradigm to one that looks at a combination of all of these things to get to a long-term 75-year fix, which would fix it essentially for everyone. I think they're up for a challenge if they want to do it just the way that the president outlined. It's nice to get votes that way, but it's not nice because you can't fix it that way. That's my opinion. And having been there, I would say I'm pretty confident in that analysis.
Yeah, and as far as what's on the table right now in Congress, Congressman Larson, who spoke at the beginning of the event, has his Social Security 2100 Act, which has pretty substantial support on the Democratic side of the aisle in terms of co-sponsors. That bill would fix Social Security's financing entirely on the revenue side. Now, on the Republican side of the aisle, we're just not seeing anything, not in Congress. Congressman Ribble, we miss you trying to reach across the aisle, come up with bipartisan solutions. We're not seeing a partisan solution or a bipartisan solution from the Republican side. The last we really heard from the Republicans about Social Security was President Trump saying that he would not cut Social Security benefits. That was a promise that he made during the election. And so Republicans are sort of in this position where they're saying, at least if the ones that are going along with what President Trump said, we're not going to cut benefits, but so too are they not going to raise taxes. So how do you solve it? So we're in kind of a tough spot. And then as Mark mentioned, we cannot change Social Security using fast track reconciliation rules. We need to have 60 votes in the Senate to make any changes to Social Security. Of course, with the current makeup of the Senate, that means that you need to have a bipartisan majority of senators to agree. And when we're stuck in a place where one party is looking only at revenues and the other party, frankly, is not looking at revenues or benefit cuts, then we're stuck.
Yeah, President Trump was a disaster on the issue because he froze Republicans from actually fixing it. I think Paul Ryan, when he was Speaker, would have liked to have done something on Social Security. I know John Boehner did, and even began work with President Obama to try to come up with a bipartisan fix. But President Trump froze Republicans, so they couldn't do it. And now, in essence, President Biden is freezing Republicans. And so it's a problem, and that's why the American voter has to break the gridlock.
I don't want to be an optimist by accident, but I do want to give a lot of credit to Chairman Larson. He has the only bill currently in Congress, the only bill I think in the last 3 Congresses that would actually make Social Security sustainably solvent. There are other Democratic bills. They were, in many cases, would get halfway there or part of the way there. There's some shell games that we could talk about. Chairman Larson solves the whole problem. Doesn't solve it in exactly the way that I would do. He does it entirely, but basically eliminates the tax max. He raises the rate pretty substantially, and then actually solves more than 100% with revenue because some of that revenue goes to expand benefits. But it's the only comprehensive solution out there. The last comprehensive Republican-only solution was the late Chairman Johnson, Chairman Larson's predecessor, who did have almost the mirror image that was done entirely on the benefit side. And I really wish we could just split the difference and call it good enough, because just losing the last 5 years since 2016 has cost us a great deal. One piece of legislation I will want to give a shout out to that doesn't solve the problem, but at least starts the conversation, is the Trust Act, the Romney-Manchin Trust Act. This has a lot of bipartisan support. Back during the last budget resolution discussion, the ARP one, it had something like 70 senators voting in favor of kind of conceptually of it. And this would create special commissions to deal with Social Security, Medicare, and the Highway Trust Fund separately. And look, that's how commissions can't be your solution, but commissions can help facilitate a solution. They can help give cover for a solution. They can help start a discussion. That's what happened in 1983. And so indirectly, commission led to the 1977 reforms as well. And I think that might be our best and only path forward if we don't want to wait until 2033.
I'm sorry, Mark, you said the best path you think is some kind of creation of a commission.
I do. It doesn't seem like there's an adult conversation in public with both parties is a promising outcome at the moment. I hope I'm wrong, but I do think a commission is an opportunity.
Is there? Oh, go ahead, Stu.
I would just say, I hope you're wrong too, Mark, that's what it takes. The Simpson Bowles came up with a solution that was very similar to the one that I proposed, but it never went anywhere. And the era that we live in, this partisan divide that's there, where really partisanship itself is masquerading as a principle, is kind of got Congress frozen. And the commission is kind of, in my opinion, the coward's way out of dealing with a hard issue. We elect members of Congress to solve these problems. And if they don't solve them, they ought to be fired and replaced with people that will. And that requires a great deal of engagement by the public. And what a commission could do is get the public engaged in a way that members of Congress won't.
Just a bit of context. So I worked on the Simpson Bowles, and we came up with what I thought was a pretty good and fair Social Security reform. The number of senators and representatives that came to me and said, I want to write this into legislation of both parties, double digits for sure, probably well over 20, maybe even 30. The number that actually introduced legislation based on that are sitting on this panel right now. So that tells you something about interest versus follow through on something difficult like Social Security.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a question from a participant, which I mean, sort of gets to the heart of this. And I feel like Congressman, maybe you could take a crack at this. Is just, why is it so hard? What is the calculus for members of Congress? And this person asks, is it the undue influence of wealthy, I guess, wealthy donors or older voters on our politics, and why it seems like there are obviously a number of proposals. It's kind of just math, right? You just need to figure out which solutions you're going to take. It's not like there's a problem coming up with a potential solution. It's just sort of agreeing on it. But why is it so hard to get there?
Yeah, it's not wealthy donors. Wealthy donors don't even care about this topic that much because they're insulated from it. And even when I offered a reform that imposed even a greater means test to it as part of the savings, they didn't really care. There was just a shrug of the shoulder and said, yeah, if that's what I need to do to protect my grandkids, go ahead and do it. And it is a fear of the largest voting bloc in America, which are quite frankly senior citizens. Senior citizens vote. And what you have to do is you have to engage senior citizens in real dialogue and conversations about what's taking place. And every single time I went back to my district and I engaged with groups like AARP or other senior groups to talk about this reform, almost universally, you could bring them around to say, yeah, this makes sense. Don't like it in its entirety, but I'm willing to accept this if it will protect my children or grandchildren or protect this program, because it is the single biggest thing that's reduced senior poverty in US history. And so it's here, it's embedded in our culture, as Kathleen says, and you have to remove the fear of not fixing it.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, was someone else going to jump in? No. Okay, I'll go ahead. I think this is an important question. Since about half of, this is from a participant, sorry. So since about half of Social Security beneficiaries don't have any other retirement resources, how low can benefits really go without driving lifelong workers into poverty? Is that something we have a good sense of?
Yeah, so the majority of seniors get most of their income from Social Security. So this is a big chunk of senior income. So we really need to, when we think about scaling back benefits, we have to think about what that means. The average Social Security retirement benefit is just $1,500 a month. And so scaling that back, especially in the lower half of the income spectrum, could be really catastrophic for some people who are living on fixed incomes, who don't have the opportunity to go out and earn more or save more. And so I think, while we look at this, we shouldn't only be looking at solvency or, financial side of Social Security. We should also be looking at the adequacy of those benefits. And again, to Congressman Ribble's great credit, he did look at that and he did include some benefit enhancements for low earners in his plan. So too does Congressman Larson include benefit enhancements for low earners in his plan. And that should be part of the conversation too, not only, the Social Security's financing, but also its benefits. And I just think there's just not a lot of room to cut Social Security benefits without causing real pain to seniors and without causing real pain to people with disabilities. And the numbers, I think, really surprise people, how small the benefits are and how much people rely on those benefits. And that's why I think we really should tilt to the revenue side. And I think, in this conversation, when we're talking about like each side of the aisle, we're really talking about politicians on each side of the aisle. When you actually talk to voters on both sides of the aisle, people are a lot more reasonable. People are a lot more open to compromise. And in fact, when you push them to make the hard choices, not to say, actually, I'd rather not have my benefits cut and I'd rather not have my taxes increased, as the politicians are saying, when you push voters to actually make those hard choices, the majority of voters of both parties would rather pay more than get less. So that's why I think that the solution should really tilt toward the revenue side of the equation, both because people rely on the benefits so much and because that's what they're saying they want us to do.
I think that is about all the time that we have for questions. I'm sorry there were a lot of you that we didn't get to, but this has been a really great
Kate, I think we have time for one more question.
You think we have time for one more? Okay.
Yes,
Okay, good.
Seeing the next panel and where they're headed, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Let me let me see here, because there are so many good ones. I was kind of curious about this, and forgive my ignorance that I should know the answer to this, but this is, I think, a good one. Years ago, there was discussion about investing a percentage of Social Security funds in equity markets to improve the growth rate of their trust fund. I haven't heard any debate on that in 2021. Is that option totally off the table? That's a question from Ron Rhodes.
I'll actually, so there was a period of time from about 1990 to 2010, we thought it would be to about 2015, that Social Security was raising more in revenue than was paying in benefits. And at that time, there were all sorts of clever ideas for what you could do with that extra money to save it. We are now in the reverse situation that we're paying more in benefits to revenue. So if you were to invest the trust fund, you basically would need to cash out that debt and increase the debt in the rest of the government. You'd also need to draw down those equity savings pretty quickly because we're drawing from the trust fund each year. And so while I think that was a very reasonable idea back in 1990 or 1995 or even 2000, it's no longer really viable unless we have enough of a tax increase to have another big round of surpluses.
Okay, that was a short one. So I'm just going to throw one last real quick one, Mark, to Congressman Roble, because I think this is good. A number of people have said, so what can I really do? Does it really make a difference to call my congressman or senator? Should I sign petitions, work with the AARP? What really will make a difference here, and raise this issue on the radar of lawmakers?
Yes, the answer is do all those things.
Okay.
A polite, thoughtful letter, email, phone call to your congressional office, both House and Senate, to both Republican and Democrat members. Don't get partisan on it yourself. Just saying, listen, I will be with you if you show the courage to solve this problem. Don't be afraid of me. They need to hear that, because what they always hear is the other side. They hear the angry side. What I discovered is that there was a real hard, angry left, which is about 5 or 6% of the vote, a real hard, angry right, which is about 5 or 6% of the vote. But that broad swipe in the middle that Kathleen spoke about, they just want members of Congress to fix the problem. And they're the quiet ones that aren't going to call or write. They need to get engaged in this issue. And if they did, members of Congress would like a miracle, find the courage necessary to solve the problem.
Great, thank you so much. All right, I think that is officially the end. It's 11:25. Thank you all so much for joining us for this part of the discussion. Thank you, Mark, Kathleen, and Reed. This has been a great conversation, and thanks to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget for hosting this talk today.
Thanks. And we're going to go right into the next panel. So we first have a video from Senator Cassidy, which again, remember, was recorded prior to the trustees report, and then a panel on the Medicare trustees report, hosted by Margot Sanger-Katz of the New York Times. So let's get that video rolling, Ben.
Senator and Dr. Bill Cassidy here. Thank you for allowing me to speak. And speaking to such a group as you, I feel like I don't have to go over the issues of Medicare solvency or insolvency. It is a program which is going bankrupt or insolvent in fiscal year 2024, perhaps 2026, but somewhere around there. And under current law, payments to providers would then become just apportioned to the amount being received, which means a doc or a hospital would receive maybe 70 to 80% of what they currently do. You speak to those hospitals and doctors, they say right now Medicare just makes their margins, and that sort of diminution of payment would get them too low, below their business model. As one doc says, if you're getting paid below your cost, you can't make it up on volume. This, of course, will affect access for patients. Now, we know we have problems. The United States spends more per capita on health care than any other developed nation. Now, there's reasons that can explain that away, mitigate it, if you will, but no one doubts that there's incredible waste associated with this. The annual report's about to come out. It'll give very targeted reasons or solutions as to what we can do to address aspects of inefficiency and waste. Now, when I speak to folks about what to do next, I always say if I'm speaking to pharma, they're pointing out insurance, doctors, and hospitals. And if I'm speaking to hospitals, they point, everybody points, but no one ever looks this way. If we're going to have a solution, it's going to be something in which everybody works. Not necessarily to lose, unless it's wasteful, unless they're benefiting from wasteful spending and malalignment. Rather, in a way in which we first empower the patient. As a doctor, I know the only way you save money is to empower the patient. You can do this by aligning benefits and having gain sharing. So the patient actually benefits if the decision is made to save money, both in terms of her pocketbook and in terms of her health. We see this can work. People are opting for Medicare Advantage increasingly, and that attempts to align incentives with gain sharing as regards the patient's finances and the patient's health, but also bringing in the provider as well. Now, believe me, there's complaints about MA. I hear them all the time. But it does show that these incentives, this gain sharing can occur. So I think looking forward, we need to take those specific issues that the annual report is going to identify. Overvalued service, services that shouldn't be paid for at all, and other things that will give us just the kind of foundation for doing something better. On the other hand, I do think we have a ways to go to where we increasingly align incentives, employ gain sharing, so that the patient is in the middle of all of our efforts. But in that gain sharing, in that alignment of benefits, she or he benefits the most, and everyone else lines up. I thank you for your efforts. I just want to make my office make it clear that we're relying on folks like you to come up with ideas that we can incorporate into legislation. I have my own ideas, but I just find that when there is thoughtful people considering an issue as complex as this, if you can find a final product that incorporates all, you end up with something more likely to pass and more likely to do good. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite our panelists for the second panel to please join us. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and ask them some questions, but just in case you missed the Social Security part of this meeting and are just joining now for the Medicare part, I just want to remind you that we do want questions from people in the audience as well. And the way to submit those, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's like a little icon that says Q&A. If you type your question in there, I will be able to see it. And I'm hoping to share a lot of audience questions in addition to my own questions. So I know you guys have bios for everyone who's here. I just want to briefly introduce our panel. We have Mike Chernow here, who is the professor of health policy at Harvard and the current chair of the MedPAC. Josh Gordon, the director of health policy at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Gretchen Jacobson, vice president for the Medicare program at the Commonwealth Fund, and Erica Sacker, vice president for healthcare policy at the Arnold Foundation. And welcome to all of you guys, and thank you for coming here. I was hoping, Josh, I know that you are out with a short article about what the Medicare trustees said yesterday. So I was hoping you could kind of lead us off with a couple of high points of what you think is important to know about what was published.
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming. I want to thank Senator Cassidy for his remarks and thank the panelists and the audience. So I think maybe kind of the real headline after the very long wait that we had for this year's trustees report is that things look very much the same as they did in the 2020 report, which given all that the country has gone through with the recession, the health crisis, is actually kind of interesting. And we can talk a little bit more about what kind of happened behind the scenes to get us to that point. But we have an identical insolvency date for the HI Trust Fund. The 75-year shortfall and overall Medicare costs are all about the same in this report as they were in April of 2020. So kind of the most important thing I think that people focus on from this report is the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, and its insolvency is projected for the year 2026. This is the closest the trust fund has been to insolvency since 1997. And if we get to 2026 without doing anything, hospital spending would be cut by 9% in that year. And then those cuts wind up growing kind of annually to about 22% by 2045, which is just a huge disruption that we certainly want to avoid. And when we look at kind of over the next decade, HI spending is projected to exceed revenue by about $580 billion. And over 75 years, that shortfall is about 0.3% of GDP, about 0.77% of payroll, which means it would take about a 27% increase in the payroll tax rate or a 16% spending cut to ensure solvency over that entire time. And then kind of even more important, I think all of us feel the more important thing is that total Medicare spending is projected to grow rapidly along with healthcare costs. And that really is why I think all of us do what we do, and we're mainly concerned about the growth of healthcare costs. And so total Medicare spending is going to grow rapidly from about 4.1% of GDP in 2021 to just above 6% by 2040. And at least in the trustees' traditional projections, grow to about 6.5% of GDP from 2070 onward. But as the trustees make clear, that assumes kind of a ratcheting down of provider payments to a level that would likely not be sustainable, meaning doctors and hospitals might stop seeing Medicare patients. So they do an alternative illustrative scenario where they kind of assume that those payments grow more closely aligned eventually with the growth in overall healthcare costs. And they see Medicare spending growing to about 6.25% in 2040 instead of 6%, and then 7.7% in 2070, and then even higher as we continue out in the projection period. So I think that's the kind of issue that we need to focus on. And of course, the sooner we act, the better off we all are, because the less drastic changes we have to make immediately, and the longer we have to really get a handle on healthcare costs. I think that's what we all care about. And I think taking action to solve this trust fund issue can bring with it reforms that can lower healthcare costs, make our healthcare system more efficient, obviously also reduce the budget deficit, which is something CRFB cares about a great deal, and can also contribute to increased economic growth. So we have a trust fund solutions initiative where we talk about a lot of the reforms that we should look at for the HI Trust Fund, as well as for Social Security and the Highway Trust Fund. And I hope we get to talk a little bit about what some of those reforms are as the panel continues. So thanks a lot for all coming.
Gretchen, I was hoping you all could also share just like a couple of high points from this report, what you think we should be really paying attention to, what stood out to you as being particularly important or salient.
Yes, I just first want to say it's a real pleasure to be here. So with the insolvency of the trust fund only 5 years away, one of the questions that really arises is what should be done by policymakers to shore up the trust fund's financing. And of course, this isn't a new problem, but the solvency of the trust fund, as shown in the report, has steadily worsened over the past 7 years. But thankfully, what I want to highlight is people have been thinking about how to address the problem for a long time as well. And there's also policy changes that could address both solvency and protect beneficiaries, including the care they receive, their out-of-pocket costs, and their access to providers. So this is critical because at the end of the day, the health of the program is essential to the health and well-being of millions of Americans. So one of the things I wanted to highlight was to help find areas of commonality across these ideas and identify new ideas. Last fall, the Commonwealth Fund asked a dozen very diverse Medicare thought leaders to recommend how they would address the trust fund and what solutions they would recommend. And one important caveat I would add is that we asked these experts to think big, as in $500 billion in savings or revenue to extend the life of the trust fund almost 10 years, which may or may not be what policymakers are currently thinking. So one of the areas that was recommended was adding new revenue to the trust fund, the most popular of which was redirecting the NIT, or the net investment income tax, to the trust fund. And this is a very popular policy option, namely because it wouldn't be a new tax on people. It would be using an existing source of funds for a different purpose. And another big savings items that were recommended were transforming Medicare to a premium support system or changing Medicare Advantage to a competitive bidding program. And both of these would have very significant changes to the Medicare program and would likely play out very differently across the country with very different effects on enrollees. And then some experts also recommended changes that have been discussed by the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission for many years, including addressing Medicare Advantage plans coding intensity, site neutral payments, reducing payments to post-acute providers. And then some also recommended other ideas that have been discussed for a while, such as changes to Medigap coverage and raising the age of Medicare eligibility. So those latter ideas have more uniform effects across the country than premium support and competitive bidding, but the effects on beneficiaries would still vary depending upon their source of coverage and their health status. And then finally, some Medicare experts also put forth new ideas, but these have relatively little savings but would improve the delivery of care and the equity of the program. So for example, introducing patient navigators to traditional Medicare to help people manage their chronic conditions, and screening for social risk factors and enhancing cultural competence among providers. And I should say we would be remiss and possibly miss an opportunity if we didn't consider these smaller budget items as part of a larger effort to reform the Medicare program and position it better longer term. And these could also have more meaningful effects on people in the program, given that 1 in 5 people in Medicare spend more than $2,000 out of pocket on healthcare costs. And these are some of the most vulnerable people in this country. It's important to not let the people get lost also in the budget discussion. So with that, I'll turn that back over to you, Marco.
So I do want to circle back to some of the solutions, because it does seem like, while the report found that the insolvency date for Medicare somehow amazingly has not changed at all, despite the crazy year in healthcare that we have had, it also, we're getting close to 2026. It's still the kind of horizon is ever approaching, even if it's not in a different place than it was before. But I also want to ask sort of a bigger question about this report and how hard it is to do the work that the actuary and the trustees are doing. It just occurs to me like no one was expecting a global pandemic. We just had, going on 2 years where there were major disruptions in the economy, but also in the healthcare system, where we saw, big increases in the demand for certain kinds of services when people got COVID, got sick, needed hospitalization. Now we have a, major national vaccination program. But also, big changes as people scaled back on elective care, both because hospitals got really crowded and also because people got scared of going places in there because of the shutdowns. And I wondered, Mike and Erica, I know both of you have been involved in this kind of modeling in your other work. I was sort of surprised to see the trustees look at all of these changes that had happened and kind of throw up their hands and say, no change, it all balances out in some way. And I'm oversimplifying, of course, what they did. There were also some technical adjustments that they made that I think helped compensate for what happened. But can you guys just give us some insight into how difficult it is to make these kinds of forecasts? It just strikes me that the Medicare forecasting has a level of complexity that is even harder than what the Social Security forecasting involves, because we have to predict what's going to happen to people's health, what's going to happen in the development of health technology, and not just what's going to happen in the economy. Erica, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Margot. So I think you're asking a really important question, and it's something that the actuaries actually speak to a lot in the report. Is just, it's always hard to do this type of modeling, and there's always a lot of assumptions baked into that, and you hope in doing it that you're making some reasonable assumptions. But one thing that really stood out to me in the report this year is how much they stress just the level of uncertainty that they had in making these estimates. And I think one thing to keep in mind with that, kind of going back to Josh's point about we should be looking at the bigger picture, and there is this alternative scenario that shows a worse financial picture than the main scenario they model, is that a lot of the uncertainty in their estimates pushes in one direction. So I think with COVID, you're right, they kind of land at, it's a wash. There's some puts and takes. It's more complicated than that, but it is kind of a wash overall. But some of the other assumptions they've made around that the physician payments will be relatively flat over time. As Josh said, maybe that doesn't end up being true. That's what they model in the alternative scenario. Financial picture looks a lot worse if that's the case, and we have higher physician payments than we expect. But they also assume full repayment of loans that were made to providers during the pandemic. And maybe that happens. I think it's also possible that there's some loan forgiveness around some of that that's paid back at a slower rate than they might anticipate. And then I think a big one is that there's a lot of uncertainty about new drugs coming to market and what those will look like. And one thing that they've left out, I think for reasonable reasons, is the inclusion of the new Alzheimer's drug, which launched at over 50,000 per year. And we're still waiting on Medicare to make a coverage determination for that. But even if the coverage determination is just a little broader than very narrow, at that price tag and with the number of people that have Alzheimer's in the Medicare population, that could have really big spending implications for the Medicare program and for Part B, in particular.
Mike, do you want to speak a little bit to some of the challenges of doing this and some of the places where, you think the actuary got it right or not right, or threw up their hands?
The actuary is always right. So first of all, thank you all very much for having me. I want to emphasize I'm speaking in my role as a professor, not in my role as MedPAC chair. I do appreciate Gretchen mentioning some of the MedPAC topics though. So what I take from the report in general is it's important to understand the different components that are leading to the spending growth estimates. And the three that I would focus on are the beneficiary numbers, growth in the number of beneficiaries. That's basically a demographics problem. And barring any big changes to eligibility age, the demographics are going to be what the demographics are going to be. And frankly, I don't think there's a ton of uncertainty around that part. The price part's a really big deal. And there, it's not so much that they're assuming that the prices are going to be relatively flat. In fact, I think they're pretty skeptical that they will be if you read the alternative scenario. It's that they're required to do a current law projection. So what they are actually, the task they're doing is not to project what's going to happen, it's what's going to happen under current law. And current law fee schedules are very flat. So in the macro physician world, where it's governed by macro MIPS, basically they're losing money relative to inflation. They have the productivity adjustment for the facilities from the ACA. So prices are scheduled to rise very slowly going forward. And there's not a ton of projection problems around that, I think, in the grand scheme of things. The noise and the challenge is all around the utilization assumptions. And if you look at this report relative to the last report, the assumption here is utilization rising faster and prices rising more slowly. And again, that's probably because they've shifted the year forward some. Assuming we're not going to change the demographics much, we really have a challenge of how to have actual realized utilization rise more slowly than the utilization growth assumed in this report. Some of that is Part A services, which relate into the trust fund, but that's not really the big issue. The big issue is Part B services, and I want to emphasize, we think of that as Part B services like physician services, which is true, but that includes things like new biologic drugs that are covered by Part B and a bunch of things like that that are really important. So Part B is a big deal, and obviously the Part D drugs matter. So again, I think our challenge going forward, and the forecasting challenge, is what's going to happen to utilization. The problem with the Alzheimer's drug that Erica mentioned, which I do agree is a problem, isn't only that it's very expensive, it's that people actually don't think the drug's very good. Imagine the challenge you would have if we were having this discussion if there was a really, really good Alzheimer's drug. That's an even bigger ethical problem in some ways, but I'll defer to others to think through that. It's really about understanding the challenges and predicting utilization. Some is health status, but a lot of it is new technologies that we want people to access, and how we can offset the cost of that by getting more efficiencies out of a system. And I think everybody would acknowledge as a lot of room for efficiency improvements.
I want to come back to something that Josh said early on, which is, you know, every year we have this report, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, but the headline is always like, what is the insolvency date for the Medicare trust fund, which, like, as we know, is really just a kind of small part of Medicare at this point. You know, the hospital program in Part A is one part, but then we also have this huge Part B that covers physician services and all kinds of other outpatient treatment. We have Medicare Advantage, which you guys have talked about, these private plans. We have Medicare Part D, which is the prescription drug part. And, you know, people who are in Medicare know about all the parts because they have to sign up for all of them. But I think a lot of us sometimes forget that the trust fund is just dealing with like this one corner of Medicare. How weird does it feel to you guys that we have this trust fund that is like just dealing with one slice of the program? And how much do you think that we are overemphasizing policy solutions that affect that part of Medicare spending and maybe ignoring things that are happening in the other parts of Medicare, which, you know, of course, also cost taxpayers money and have effect on the federal deficit and other things?
Well, I can start. I mean, I think I have three answers. One, I've been doing this since about 2000, and 5 years away from insolvency is a pretty big deal for kind of, you know, the healthcare space. So, and then I would add to that hospital care is a huge part of where we still spend our money on healthcare in this country, and this is the health insurance that covers that for you know, every senior in the country. So I think it's a big deal in that sense too. But also, I should say that I was reading this report this year kind of with different eyes, I think, because Medicare Advantage is becoming such a huge part of the Medicare program. By the end of kind of the next 10 years, about half of all beneficiaries will be in Medicare Advantage. And the way the trustees present this report is very old school, and kind of you lose sight of the fact that half of beneficiaries do have an insurance product that covers all of these parts together, instead of looking at everything discretely the way the trustees traditionally do. So I think in that sense, it maybe felt a little weirder to me than normal because I'm so used to it. But we really do have kind of a unified program that the trustees kind of don't really talk about very much. And I know that we at CRFB have been doing a lot of research on MA, and I know everyone on the panel has been thinking a lot about MA. And I really do think that we really have to kind of have two discussions, because we have to do something about MA as an insurance program. And then we also have to look at traditional fee-for-service Medicare, which CMMI does a lot of stuff on, and maybe we'll talk about that, but there's a lot of delivery system reform that involves these discrete parts of Medicare, even though, you know, now half of all people are not in that program. So I think that's something I really took away from reading this report.
I would add one more thing to add on to Josh's remarks, that MA really also has a role in the effect of the pandemic on spending that I think has really not been elevated. I mean, essentially in traditional Medicare, we saw, you know, a 6% or so drop in spending in 2020. But that's only traditional Medicare. And Medicare Advantage spending didn't change at all, because they're capitated payments that are not tied at all to actual use of services. And so with more than 40% of people in Medicare Advantage plans, that really changes the dynamic of how much actual change in spending you expect to see. Although overall, we did see, I think, less foregone care and less postponed care among Medicare beneficiaries than among younger people in the population.
Kind of a related question about Medicare Advantage. You know, as we see more and more Medicare beneficiaries in these private capitated plans, and, you know, the actuary actually is estimating a continuing migration into those plans, how much harder does it get to pull the traditional levers to try to constrain spending in Medicare? I feel like, you know, we have this CMMI apparatus, we have, you know, a suite of policy choices that Congress has considered, but, you know, that used to be almost all of Medicare was affected by those changes. And now we're looking at a little more than half. And in a couple of years, we'll be looking at a little less than half. You know, are we starting to kind of lose our ability to use policy to constrain Medicare spending as more and more of Medicare is kind of leaking out into this other type of program where private insurers have a lot more discretion about how to spend?
Can I try and take a stab at that, Margot?
Yeah.
So I think it's a mistake to treat the Medicare Advantage program as separate from the traditional Medicare program, for the most important reason is the Medicare Advantage benchmarks, what those plans get paid, is based on what's happening outside of Medicare Advantage. So if you control spending and make the spending in the fee-for-service sector more efficient through whatever mechanism you want, those efficiencies will flow through to the Medicare Advantage program. We do have an issue of Medicare Advantage pricing and how much we pay the Medicare Advantage plans. I believe the Medicare Advantage plans do create a lot of efficiencies, none of which really flow through to the actual Medicare program because of the nature of how we pay Medicare Advantage. So I think there's a technical problem that's worth discussing, which is if Medicare Advantage gets very big, basing its payment on what's happening in the fee-for-service sector of Medicare becomes mathematically more challenging. So I think we do need to think, for a variety of reasons, about how to reform how we pay Medicare Advantage plans. But at least the way that the system is set up now, any efficiencies that we can garner in the traditional Medicare sector will flow through to the Medicare Advantage program. And I might add, any efficiencies that the Medicare Advantage program creates in how care is practiced tend to spill over and lower spending in the traditional Medicare program. These programs are connected. The providers typically serve both Medicare Advantage patients and traditional Medicare patients. And so I think we still have many of the same levers. It's just we have added levers as to how we might deal with the Medicare Advantage program.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the policy environment that we find ourselves in now. You know, I know you guys are all focused on solutions to try to make the trust fund hang in longer. I feel like, to me, this feels like very far from where Congress and the White House are right now. We're seeing a big reconciliation package that's taking shape in Congress right now, where Democrats are trying to expand Medicare in a lot of ways. These are mostly outside of the hospital program, but they want to add new benefits to Part B for dental, vision, and hearing services. I think there's some effort to make some changes to Part D to, lower out-of-pocket spending and simplify the program. I guess I'm just, and one more thing that I wanted to write about and haven't written about, which is we had the budget from the White House that came out a few months ago. And really for the first time that I can remember in my time at Washington, there was almost nothing on the Medicare side at all. Gretchen, you mentioned some of those kind of consensus ideas that are sort of like little, policy changes that are widely embraced by folks like you guys. And we saw those in both the Obama budgets and in the Trump budgets, desire to do some of these kind of goo-goo, technocratic fixes to reduce spending and improve efficiency of the program. And the Biden budget didn't include any of that. Do you guys feel like this is a hard time to make the case that the finances of Medicare are an important public policy goal?
I feel like someone else would be better able to answer that question. It is certainly not a hard time to make the case that the finance of Medicare is an important policy goal. The trust fund coming down the road is important, and we need to deal with that sooner rather than later. I actually think there's a lot of attention to aspects of Medicare, and I sit in a place where I hear a lot of Medicare discussions, so I don't want to be too egocentric in my answer. I'll defer to others, but the Medicare Advantage discussion is about as robust as I've heard it lately. There's a lot of discussion around actually adding new benefits. Dental, vision, hearing are the ones that we hear all the time to add. And the tension here, I think, is the problems in Medicare, which I mentioned before, are largely about getting efficiencies and managing the projected or the assumed volume growth, are very different from the broad problems in the healthcare sector, because outside of Medicare, the big problem is the price of everything. And so we're sort of having two health policy debates, and they need to address very different issues. One is the efficiency of how we deliver Medicare to an ever-growing number of Medicare beneficiaries, preserving access and quality. And the other one is how do we control market failures and excessive pricing and of a whole range of things in the commercial sector. I guess prescription drugs have both problems. But anyway, I don't think it's a problem to make the debate that it's important. I just think it's a very challenging political area to wade into.
I mean, I'll also say from a practical perspective, if they want to add these benefits to Medicare, they're going to need to pay for them or else they'll be temporary. I mean, that's why this discussion of health savings is so important. If you want to be adding benefits, you need to find kind of offsetting savings. And I mean, I think it could be, you can be even more broad than that, that they've said that they want their reconciliation bill to be paid for. And we certainly encourage them to do that. And for that, you'll have to probably get Medicare savings, but also that's why they're talking about prescription drug savings and other items like that. So, I mean, the policy discussion might not be on, a bundle of ways to save money in Medicare, the way that prior president budgets kind of bundled them together and laid them out. But I do think those savings ideas have to be part of the discussion in order for them to get any legislation that they're wanting to do through the reconciliation process forward.
I would just add, there's certainly been a lot of discussion around how to make Medicare more efficient and also provide more benefits. I think there's much less focus so far and attention on the Medicare trust fund aspect of that's been a completely separate discussion at this point and not necessarily weeded into all of the other Medicare discussions.
I want to bring in some questions from our audience because they've sent a lot of good ones. And I want to start with one from Elizabeth Bauer, who points out, there is no trust fund for parts B and D. We just kind of pay for those parts of Medicare with general revenues. Is there a benefit to maintaining a trust fund for Medicare Part A at all, or is this just kind of an anachronism?
So there are some policy ideas out there to do bigger things like combining the trust funds and having more of a unified trust fund. I think one benefit, though, to having the Part A trust fund is that it does serve as kind of a warning sign for where the program is at. I think that as we've all been saying, I think here today, like we should be thinking beyond the Part A trust fund. And if we focus just on that as a silo, we're not looking at the bigger picture of where the Medicare program has fiscal challenges and how we can improve the program. But it is something that's making us have this conversation and kind of think about what should we be doing to fix the fiscal situation that the Medicare program faces. And so I think it's not the only warning light that exists, but it is, like, I think, a useful thing to focus attention on some of the fiscal challenges that the program faces.
So I have another question from Joyce Frieden from MedPage Today, and she asks, what effect do you guys think the use of alternative payment models will have on these projections? Do you think they'll end up lowering costs? I know this is an ongoing debate among various modelers, and perhaps gets back to this larger question of what a hard job the actuary faces.
I really want to at least get my 2 cents in on this. As I mentioned, I think the fundamental challenge in Medicare is how we deal with the growing volume. And you see that very clearly in this report. And there's a lot that can be done in terms of alternative payment models to address that. And I think we will find that alternative payment models will be central to doing that. And there's a ton of activity in the alternative payment model space. I think we're at the beginning. Many people will say, we haven't saved a lot of money in alternative payment models so far, let's do something else. But if something else involves lowering prices, which, by the way, I think there's room to do in some places, prices are growing in this report 0.7% below inflation overall. You know, all the pressures that the actuaries talk about are that prices are not going to rise as slowly as projected. So this is about volume, and volume is really about low value care, because we want to maintain access. Access is good volume. Low value care is bad volume. And alternative payment models give providers the flexibility to gain when they reduce low value care. And we need to build better alternative payment models. So this is, again, just a Michael personal view. I think even if you don't put into your forecast that APMs will be the way out, I think in the end of the day, if we're going to get more efficient care, we're probably going to need some aspect of payment reform. And I believe APMs and better designed APMs are central. And if you read what the CMS leadership, Chiquita and others wrote, Liz, there's a lot of energy around that in their blog with Dan Tsai. So I really think it's going to be an important thing. And I think that it's a journey. We have not obviously found the magic design, but I think we can do a lot better. And I think we need to do a lot better, because controlling volume is a lot harder than controlling prices, particularly in a program which is founded on the notion that the Medicare program is not going to directly influence the practice of medicine. So you're not going to do direct utilization review of things, maybe in Medicare Advantage, but that's people choose that. So I view them as essential, and making better APMs is essential.
And let me just put kind of a pithy point on that. When you look at the difference between the trustees' projections and their alternative scenario, the way you get from the alternative scenario to their actual projections is to figure out ways to have more efficient care. And that's what the alternative payment models are supposed to do. So, I mean, either way, the program is growing, but we'd like it to grow closer to their base projection than their alternative scenario. And that's why we need to do these payment models.
So we have a couple of audience questions about Medicare Advantage, and I know we've touched on this already. This is a growing part of the program. It's an expensive part of the program because of the way the benchmarks are constructed. Can any of you guys talk a little bit more specifically about possible reforms to Medicare Advantage that you think might be helpful in aligning incentives appropriately, but also maybe righting the fiscal ship a little bit too?
There's a MedPAC recommendation, which basically involves a few things. There's a lot of aspects of it. I won't go through it, but essentially It involves changing the form of benchmarks to get around this quartile. The quartiles are very inequitable and kind of clunky. That's probably a small part of it. And then taking some money out of Medicare Advantage. We think Medicare Advantage plans are probably overpaid on the order of 4+%. You could decide if you think that's too big or too little. There's a lot of analytic debate, but enrollments are a record high, benefits are a record high. And so there are trade-offs. It is not an easy, just let's lower payments and we'll get the same thing. But I think there's some room to take some money out of Medicare Advantage, recognizing that you'll be giving up some of the added rebate. And I encourage people to read the MedPAC chapter that discusses that, plus a bunch of other, I would call, you kind of poo-pooed some of these minor technical fixes you have to really like to read if you want to read the MedPAC chapters.
Gretchen, I know you had hinted at some ideas about competitive bidding or changing the way that the bids are constructed for Medicare Advantage. Do you want to talk a little bit more detail about that?
Sure. Those were many experts that wrote blogs wrote about included competitive bidding or premium support as part of the recommendations, which I would say those would both be very large changes to the program. Premium support in particular would be a fairly significant change to how Medicare currently operates. There's competitive bidding, in essence, would have the plans basically bid differently and it would be competitive against each other rather than against a fixed benchmark set in statute. The other ideas that were put forward were things like coding intensity. This has been in the news lately and seems to always sort of be in the news of how much the difference in how plans code for conditions relative to how conditions are coded for beneficiaries in traditional Medicare, and how that difference in coding leads to higher payments by plans simply because plans have different incentives to code. And so some of the policy options that have been discussed, including by MedPAC, have been to sort of make additional adjustments based on coding intensity to adjust that. Others have suggested changes to the star rating system, which provides bonuses and additional rebates to plans to use for extra benefits. And then there's also just been discussed smaller changes, like changes to risk adjustment. But there hasn't been discussed so far any sort of larger changes to Medicare, to Medicare Advantage, such as how to disentangle it from traditional Medicare and the pros and cons of sort of going in that direction of the long term.
I feel like most of our conversation has focused on the spending side of Medicare. And, one thing that the trustees point out in their report is there's, two ways that you can fix this problem. You can spend less or you can tax more. Do any of you guys recommend, or do you think that there is serious consideration of thinking about adjusting revenues going into the trust fund? I know as part of the Affordable Care Act, there was an increase in the payroll tax used to fund Medicare. Would it be worth looking at that again? And is anyone really talking about that seriously who's in a position to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very popular option that people put forward. They especially, as I said, the redirecting the NIT, which again was another tax that was created by the Affordable Care Act, and redirecting it from the Treasury and dedicating it to the trust fund. So in essence, it's moving money rather than creating a new tax. But I think others suggested, closing loopholes to and taxing higher incomes. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Erica, or if you.
So just to add a couple things there, I think it's really important that we think about both sides of the ledger, both increasing revenues and decreasing spending where there are overpayments and where we can get more efficiency in the Medicare program. I think on the tax side, just to elaborate on a couple of the things that Gretchen mentioned, there's this notion of just shifting over the net investment income tax money to the trust fund. Just that by itself, as Gretchen said, doesn't raise any new revenue. And I think of it as kind of an accounting gimmick. That said, I think shifting it over and combining that with reforms that would raise more revenue through the NIT is something that's really worth considering. When the Medicare program was first created, salaries and wages were about 2/3 of personal income, and now they're only about half. And so the net investment income tax, which is the tax on the unearned piece of income, that's not going into the trust fund right now, and we're kind of losing out on that source of income. But I think it should be combined with broadening the base for the net investment income tax to make sure that we're capturing some income that kind of falls between the Medicare payroll tax and the net investment income tax, and is not subject to either one of those currently. And so I really view that as a loophole that we should close and broaden the base. And we should also be considering things like increasing the payroll tax potentially. But I think broadening the base of the net investment income tax as a first step makes a lot of sense.
Margot?
Yeah.
The way I think about this is there's two things that we need. We need to cover more people. And if you look at the evidence of the number of workers per beneficiary, we have a core demographic problem. So we need to cover more people, and then we need to provide access to new technology, at least new technology that provides value. And my general view is we should fund as much of that as possible by getting as much efficiency as we can. And then we can look to what revenue's left over to fund the fact that there's more people and we want access to new technologies. In all of these cases, Medicare Advantage is the perfect example. No matter how you lower spending through competitive bidding, premium support, changes to the administrative benchmarking rules, changes to the quality stars rating, all of those are ramifications for the benefits that people get access to, because a lot of people are using Medicare Advantage as a way to cover the holes in an otherwise somewhat spotty Medicare benefit package. And when you pull that money out, you're pushing more money, more responsibility onto beneficiaries. And that's the core trade-off we have. And if we can get efficiency to alternative payment models or any other way, it just makes all those tough trade-offs much easier to do. It's just hard to get those efficiencies.
I'm just struck though, we're looking at 5 years, like, how quickly can we make those changes to right the ship, and how much should we be looking? I feel like politically tax increases are hard, but mechanically it seems like it's an easier way to solve the trust fund problem. Josh, do you have thoughts about revenue?
I think what everyone else has said is right. I would point out that that the one thing the president's budget did talk about was broadening the base of the NIT and bringing in more revenue for trust fund solvency. So I think that's certainly a piece. And more generally, this kind of goes back to what CRFB really stands for, that we have the size of government that we want, and then we need to be willing to pay for it. And certainly our healthcare programs fit into that. And I would point out, Medicare does a better job of controlling costs than the private healthcare system. But again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay for the program as it gets more expensive and as more people join it. So it's always good to look at both sides of the ledger.
I have one question from the audience that's sort of a factual question, but maybe it's worth exploring because actually I've got 2 or 3 like this. Can someone explain how Medicare Advantage relates to the hospital trust fund? Just sort of like, what is the math of that?
I think we're all struggling. Who wants to go and answer this? So I guess I will. So it's so Medicare Advantage payments come from both the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund and the SMI Trust Fund, Part A and Part B, because that's where the services that are provided for Medicare Advantage plans. And then Part D is a separate bidding process and separate funds, but the monthly capitated payments come from both SMI and the HI Trust Fund. So essentially, if you reduce Medicare Advantage payments, or if Medicare Advantage payments increase, it affects both the HI Trust Fund, and it also will affect Medicare Part B premiums for people. So it has sort of a dual effect, since money comes from both sides.
And I would just add that if you look for savings in Medicare Advantage, about half of those savings tend to flow into the trust fund, and the other half accrues to Medicare.
Okay. We have a question about another thing under consideration by Congress, I think maybe like a little bit less seriously than some of the things that we've talked about before, but there is a discussion of lowering the Medicare eligibility age perhaps to 60. How would this work financially? How does it fit into the larger conversation that we're having?
I'm scared to say anything, but I'm going to.
This is a safe space.
Yeah, you can't even see the full space. So obviously, if you put more people into Medicare, it makes the Medicare program look more expensive. On the other hand, the people you're putting in, you're spending less in general per person because you're paying a lot lower price than they were getting in the commercial sector. There's a lot of other challenges. What does it do to the exchanges, for example, as you pull those people in? And so it's a much more complicated philosophical debate about the government's role and the private sector's role and how we deal with the dysfunction in the commercial sector relative to having to finance more people through the Medicare program. That's where I think the debate is. The only thing that I think probably doesn't get enough attention is the more people and therefore the more care you bring into Medicare, because the prices in Medicare are about half of what they are in commercial, you see a big revenue hit to the providers. And that is a separate issue. I think that overall, national healthcare spending probably would go down if you did something like that, because you're moving people from a high cost to a lower cost sector. But there's a lot of other reasons why that's a problem, and what you think that would do to provider revenues and how the general equilibrium would work out makes it, you asked about difficult forecasting things before, Margot. This is a really difficult forecasting thing as you work through all the secondary effects of doing that. So that's my no policy position answer.
And I should just add that we don't really know how much it would cost in the normal budget scoring analysis. We put out kind of an estimate when President Biden proposed this during the campaign. That would be about $200 billion over 10 years. But the CBO has never actually scored this. And so I don't think we're really certain about how much it would cost. But again, it would be another kind of expense and without the revenue to kind of cover that if you're just adding that into a list of policies, because the premiums, it's not clear how the premiums would be set, whether it would be set like traditional Medicare where 25% was paid by premiums, 75% by the government, or whether for some reason just the 60 to 65 population would pay for their entire benefit in premiums before they turn 65. So there are a lot of choices you would have to make there as well.
So unfortunately, we're just about out of time. So I want to just take a minute to thank our panelists for this really smart conversation. Thanks to the committee for hosting this event. And I really want to thank the audience for making my job really easy by offering us a lot of really smart, incisive questions, many of which I hadn't thought of. Thanks so much, everybody.